Welcome to this explainer. You know, it's wild to think about, but how exactly do you build a massive, complex nation on paper before it even exists in reality? Well, today we're diving into some absolutely fascinating handwritten study notes that act as the literal architectural blueprints for modern India's administration.
I mean, modern nations run on massive institutions, right? We see the final products today, the central banks, the sprawling railway networks, the civil service exams, but we're going to look at exactly how these structures were built from scratch. And we're doing it commission by commission, all through the lens of a student's incredibly organized notes. We're using these super detailed handwritten study notes as our primary guide to trace the evolution of the state. Just take a look at the meticulous detailing here. These pages capture the specific committees that engineered a subcontinent's governance over decades. It's literally like watching massive historical shifts get boiled down into perfectly structured bullet points. So, here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll be looking at 1. Managing famines and crises. 2. Shaping currency and transport. 3. The Royal Commissions. 4. Reforming the civil service. And 5. Political shifts and pacts.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Managing Famines and Crises.
We really have to start with the grim reality of the 19th century. Back then, the state's primary function wasn't some grand economic strategy. It was literally just managing life and death crises across a vast population. It's pretty sobering to see the tragic frequency of these famines plotted out here, and how the administrative response evolved. In 1876, right after the Great Famine in Bengal, Lord Lytton constituted the Strachey Commission. That focused on setting up basic famine courts and an irrigation department. But you know, as the crises just kept coming, the state's response had to mature. By 1897, the Lyle Commission, adapted by suggesting immediate relief for peasants upon crop failure and creating separate administrative departments in the districts. And then, just 4 short years later, in 1901, the MacDonald Commission took it even further. They recommended proactive rural credit schemes and the interest-free distribution of loans, so you can trace the state adapting from sheer desperate reaction to actual financial support.
Moving right along to Section 2, Shaping Currency and Transport.
So now we shift from sheer crisis management to building the actual infrastructural and economic backbone of the nation. Obviously, a country needs a standardized way to trade and a physical way to move its goods. Looking here, you can see currency oversight progress steadily. It started with the 1888 Henry Commission, which you might also know as Fowler, examining the rupee's convertibility with gold. Then the Chamberlain Commission dealt with standard reserves of gold. But the absolute heavyweight on this page, that's got to be the Hilton Young Commission, which was tasked with reviewing the entire banking and currency system.
And this brilliantly illustrates how historical commissions directly shape our present. Why? Because the Hilton Young Commission's recommendations to establish a central bank to monitor export, import, and remittances directly led to the establishment of the Reserve Bank of India in 1935. Think about that. The RBI, the very institution managing India's massive economy today, started right here.
Now, beyond the money, they had to manage a massive, sprawling railway network. And to remember the dense history of these railway reform commissions, the author of these notes uses a seriously clever study hack, the Roma mnemonic. R stands for the Robertson Commission in 1902, which recommended setting up a railway board. O is just a filler letter to make the trick work. Then you've got M for Mackay, and finally A for Acworth.
And that A for the Acworth Commission is huge. They made the massive decision to officially separate the railway budget from the general budget, a practice that was successfully implemented in 1924. This was a gigantic shift in how public funds and infrastructure were managed, and it really goes to show just how colossal the railway system had become by that point.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Royal Commissions.
To handle the broader, day-to-day management of the state, these sweeping inquiries known as Royal Commissions were launched to essentially design the rules of everyday society. These really laid the groundwork for modern governance across all facets of life. You have Charles Hobhouse pushing for local administrative decentralization, while the Whitley Commission stepped in to regulate daily wages and fix working hours. On the agrarian side of things, Lord Linlithgow drove agricultural research and cooperative societies. And crucially, the Sandhurst Commission tackled army reforms, recommending the landmark inclusion of Indians in the officer cadre.
Next up is Section 4, Reforming the Civil Service.
Because, let's face it, a government is absolutely nothing without the people who run it. Over the decades, we see this progressive stepladder of Indian inclusion. A very slow, often reluctant opening of the doors of power. It kicks off with the Aitchison Commission in 1886, dividing civil services into imperial, provincial, and subordinate tiers. Then, the Islington Commission in 1912 pushed for simultaneous exams in India and England, finally leveling the playing field for locals to compete. This all culminates in the 1924 League Commission, which established the Provincial Service Commission and the UPSC. Yep, the very same body that still governs civil service testing today. It also recommended a 20% seat reservation for minorities.
Now, a crucial takeaway here is that the 1912 Islington Commission recommended a massive 25% of higher posts be specifically filled by Indians. That marked a major shift in administrative power. It was a totally critical step towards self-governance, but happening from within the system itself.
And finally, we arrive at Section 5, Political Shifts and Pacts.
At this point, our narrative shifts entirely away from British administrative control and moves towards Indian political agency and, of course, the fraught, highly complex transition of power. In the notes, we see movements like the Khudai, Khidmatgar, also known as the Red Shirt Party. Constituted in 1929 in the northwestern frontier province by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, this party was deeply involved in the civil disobedience movement. And what's really incredible is that despite the wildly turbulent era, they believe deeply in Gandhian nonviolence and maintain very close ties to the Indian National Congress.
And as a really amazing historical footnote captured here in these notes, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan's legacy of peace and nonviolence was so profound that he later became the very first foreigner to receive India's highest civilian award, the Bharat Ratna.
Now, as independence loomed closer, political negotiations grew increasingly desperate. On the eve of independence, following the failure of the Rajaji formula, two leaders stepped up: Phula Shah Desai, deputy leader of the INC in the Central Assembly, and Liaquat Ali Khan, a leader of the Muslim League. Together, they crafted the 1945 Desai-Liaquat formula. This was basically an unofficial, last-ditch attempt to secure an equal number of Hindus and Muslims in the central executive. But as the notes clearly tell us, it was never officially accepted by either the INC or the Muslim League.
Which leaves us with this massive, profound what if. If a formula for equal Hindu and Muslim representation in the central executive had actually been officially accepted back in 1945, how different would the map look today? It's a stark reminder that the echoes of these historical commissions, these administrative blueprints, and yes, these failed political pacts, aren't just trivia in a notebook. They still absolutely shape the daily reality of the subcontinent today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the blueprints around you.